I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. When Stephen Hennigan, the president and CEO of Credit Human, started to imagine a new headquarters in downtown San Antonio, he knew he didn't just want an ordinary building. And to learn more about what came to be built in downtown Alamo City, I'm joined now by Express News senior reporter Josh Baugh, who covers environmental issues in the San Antonio and Bexar County area. So, Josh, great to have you back here on the podcast. Before we learn more about Credit Human and what's currently being built with that company, as someone who spent 10 years covering City Hall for the San Antonio Express News, I'd love to hear some short thoughts on Saturday's municipal election. Maybe has anything stood out to you thus far? And if you have any predictions for what the voters are going to choose.
Well, real quickly, on the 10 council races, you've got a couple of seats that will definitely have new people. District 4, Ray Saldana is term limited. And then in District 6, the incumbent, Greg Brockhouse, is running for mayor. So that seat's open. So you'll definitely have new council members in those two seats. It looks pretty much like a fairly status quo election going into Election Day. For the council seats, it looks like incumbents are going to fare well. There may be runoffs in a couple of the seats, and in the mayor's race, Brockhouse has run, I think, a tougher campaign than a lot of people expected. I think he's doing better than a lot of people expected. I think that Mayor Ron Nierenberg, the incumbent, I think that his team is still fairly confident that they're going to be successful on Saturday. There could be a runoff. If that happens, the ball kind of goes up in the air and it's anybody's to grab. But it looks like this Chick-fil-A issue that we've reported on a lot has captured a lot of attention and is driving at least some voters to the polls. Whether chicken outweighs the accusations against Brockhouse about domestic violence, having had police called on him a couple times over his different marriages, that remains to be seen. And there's a lot of pundits who are weighing in on whether it should or shouldn't. So ultimately, I think we're going to see a pretty close election. And I don't think it's a slam dunk for the mayor, but a lot of the conventional wisdom still kind of leans in his direction.
And I'm going to be paying attention to Monday's episode of the Puro Politics podcast hosted by Gilbert Garcia. You have appeared on the show in the past before. I'm guessing you might pop in and out here on future episodes as well. I'm sure there's going to be a fun discussion on that one. So you can check out that podcast as well as all of our podcasts at expressnews.com/podcast. So Josh, now back to the main story of today's conversation here on the In-Depth podcast. Let's start with the history of the Credit Human Credit Union and its CEO, Stephen Hennigan, and then how that plays into their new headquarters.
So Stephen Hennigan is a former board member of CPS Energy. He served for 10 years on that board. He's a New Orleans native, lived in San Antonio for a long time, and he's now the CEO of Credit Human, which is the former San Antonio Credit Union. Many years ago, it's more than a decade at this point, Stephen built a house on the far north side and went all in on the environmental aspect of it. So he did a major solar panel array. He does rainwater catchment. So he's catching all the runoff on his property. He stores it and treats it, and that's what his family uses for their drinking water and all their water needs. And then he also has a series of geothermal wells, and so he's tapped into a constant temperature below the Earth's surface. And it's a fairly old technology actually, and it cycles in a closed system, a liquid into the ground, and it transfers heat or coolness underground, and then it comes back up. And he uses that for heating and cooling. So that's kind of the genesis of his foray into sustainable construction. Fast forward to now, his bank has partnered with Silver Ventures, which is the company behind the Pearl redevelopment, and they're doing a office tower complex. Credit Human's building a 12-story tower that will be their headquarters, and then Silver Ventures is going to have a kind of a sister building on the same property that will be available for tenants to lease. And they're using all those same technologies. So they've got a 1 megawatt solar array that's going to go on the top of the buildings in the parking garage, which will generate enough power for 200 homes. They've got the geothermal well field beneath the surface, so they're tapping into that same heat source. They've got the rainwater catchment, and also they'll be capturing condensate from the air conditioning system, which has reduced their demand for water from the San Antonio water system significantly. And then they also have a really kind of high-tech building envelope, so super tight construction so that air can't escape, the conditioned air can't get out. They've got super high reflective windows so that they're bouncing a lot of the radiant heat that comes from the sun will be bouncing back off the building. And of course, all of the top is covered with solar panels, and so there's kind of a natural barrier from the sun there. So that's going to reduce the demand for cooling primarily in the building. And so this all kind of comes together, and it's a very unique project because this is the first time as far as we can tell in San Antonio history, where all of these different sustainable elements have been put together in a single project, mid-rise office tower. So you'll see bits and pieces of this here and there on different projects, but this is the first one that's really done all of it and putting it all together to have what appears to be the most sustainable, what will be the most sustainable building ever constructed in San Antonio.
So in your story that's available now at expressnews.com, a lot more details than we can get to today. But one thing that you did write was that Hennigan, he had all these lofty goals for the company's new headquarters. He talked to the board, talked about the efficiency measures that even though initially they're more expensive, they would save money in the long run. And they were won over. The project was put together. It was approved. Construction is ongoing now. It seems from my perspective, correct me if I'm wrong, that especially as you've already laid out his personal history and how a lot of these technologies that you just mentioned were technologies that you also mentioned about him and his family, he was really key to all this happening. I mean, would this never have ever taken place, anything close to this, had he not been the CEO of this company?
I mean, that's a prediction that's kind of hard for me to make. But it seems like he is definitely the brainchild. He's definitely been the driving force behind this. Silver Ventures has been a sustainable, driven company in the redevelopment of the Pearl. And Bill Schoen, who's the managing director for real estate, kind of the leading force for Silver Ventures, said that all along the way, Credit Humans project and their input on this has really kind of pushed the envelope for them, whereas they thought that they were really kind of leading. Hennigan has really kind of taken the ball and charged forward. And so, yeah, I think that, look, this sort of project is happening a lot, in places like San Francisco and New York. This is more the norm for the coasts, but that development practice hasn't moved as much into the center of the country. And it's definitely not happened here. In South Texas, natural resources have been fairly plentiful and inexpensive. So electricity has been cheap. We've got a municipally owned utility that's done a good job of keeping prices for electricity fairly low. Water has been abundant, and there's been a lot of conservation efforts, and so we have this source of water beneath us, and so there hasn't been this really hardcore push to drive development into the next generation. Things have been kind of done in traditional ways here because that's the status quo, and it's worked and it's affordable. But Hennigan has made a major bet, and he says, he believes, and I think the conventional wisdom is that the cost of utilities will continue to rise over the next 50 years. So every time there's an adjustment in cost for those resources, whether it be water or electricity, they're going to go up. They're not going to come back down. And so we are right now experiencing the lowest cost for those utilities that we will have. And so every time they get more expensive with his building that has reduced its demand for water and for electricity, he will be saving money, and because he won't be paying for those more expensive utilities. And so, this is kind of a canary in a way. There's the city's discussion happening now about the climate plan. This project has happened completely outside of that discussion, but touches on a lot of the elements that you would see kind of unveiled in a climate plan. You know, more efficient construction, you know, lowering demand, all the things that they have packaged in this building would be kind of what the targets of the climate plan are in the future. And so it kind of gives us a sense of where you can go currently within a budget and what could be the expectation in the future and how buildings might be constructed as we look out 20, 30, 40 years.
That's a great transition. I wanted to talk about the climate plan. Obviously, that's something that you've been following, you've been writing about. What's the current status of this action plan? You know, there's been controversy surrounding it. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe they just reached a point where they've stopped public input for the time being, but public input is still being taken and it will be reopened further into the future before the plan comes back to the council.
Yeah, so you know the city councils in San Antonio serve 2-year terms, and the first thing that the current council did under Ron Nierenberg was pass a resolution in support of the Paris Climate Accord, and that kickstarted what has developed into SA Climate Ready, which is this climate action and adaptation plan. So over the course of the last 2 years, city staffers and members of the community and a consultant have been working to put this draft plan together. And it happened in a very public way, but there wasn't a lot of attention paid to it. And then earlier this year, the draft plan was completed. It was unveiled and given to the public for review. And that's when the controversy started to kick up. There are business interests. The Chamber of Commerce have voiced concerns about the cost of implementation. The plan itself, the draft plan, is very light on detail on cost. Largely because it's really difficult, these people who've put together say, to make accurate estimations of what things might cost in the future. And so the current plan has it broken out very simply with dollar signs, 1, 2, or 3, to indicate how much a strategy might cost. They're talking about stripping that out altogether as they revamp the plan and put out a second draft for public review later this month. So originally, the council was supposed to adopt this plan in April. That got delayed until May, until after the Saturday election. And then that got delayed again because there are all these competing factors and concerns. And so now there's a schedule to adopt the plan at some point this year in the fall, although they haven't indicated an exact date yet. But there's still a lot to work through. There's still the desire from the city is to get as much consensus and buy-in as possible, and so they're circling back now to some of the largest critics. Valero and New Star have privately voiced a lot of concerns about it, and so they want to make sure, the city wants to make sure that their voice is heard. They are major employers in San Antonio, and so they're working on trying to capture what the largest group of San Antonians can agree on without reducing those goals, which are to be carbon free by 2050.
So stepping back to Credit Human, when completed next year, their headquarters, as you've pointed out, it'll be the first commercial building in San Antonio to really combine all of these energy efficient technologies. As someone who, reported on local politics for so long and now a senior reporter for the Express News covering the environment, what does this first mean to you?
Well, one of the questions I asked in talking to people about this project, and the response was it's too soon to tell, is whether this is going to kind of instigate sort of an arms race among private development. So what Credit Human has done is shown, and if this building comes online and it actually performs the way they expect it to, I think they actually think it's going to perform better. But they're the basic idea is to undersell and over deliver. And so I think that we may see when this building gets up and running that it's going to be even more sustainable than what they've projected. And what Credit Human is showing is that doing these sustainable measures can fit within a budget. Their project cost went up by about 4% over what a conventionally built building would have been. So those added sustainability features cost them an extra 4%. They have not publicly announced what their project cost is, but a city document showed that it was about $113 million. And they're going to pay off those extra sustainable elements over the first 12 or so years of the existence of this building. So it's viable, it's feasible to be a little bit more green when you build. And the question I think outstanding now is whether as new projects get announced, will they attempt to match or one up the Credit Human building? Do we see a new trajectory for construction in San Antonio, which is really what needs to happen? Or does the next project just return back to the status quo? We won't know until these future projects that have been announced start to kind of add a little bit more texture and detail to what their plans are.
And then finally, Josh, as we wrap up here, final thoughts and also something that I thought was interesting from your article that once again is available now at expressnews.com. Even with all of these green features, for the first time all combined into the same building, the same complex, Credit Human won't be a net zero energy building, meaning that it will need more energy from an outside source than it can generate on its own. So, they tried their best, and obviously this is a great step forward, especially as you pointed out for San Antonio, not on the coasts. But I guess I just wonder what your thoughts are about that. Does that mean anything here? And I guess even the tiniest negative way?
I'm not sure that it's negative. I think it's just a little bit of a reality check that, part of the city's climate action plan is to adopt eventually a net zero building code so that any new building or major renovation would require that that structure produce the energy it needs in a net basis on site. And so, in the Credit Human situation, that's a 3-acre site. There's 2 towers and a parking garage, and every roof surface is to be covered with solar panels, and all of that power will be dedicated to the Credit Human building. They're going to net about, I think, 65% of their energy need from their solar panels. And so they're still going to rely on CPS energy to provide electricity when the sun's not up, at nighttime, so on and so forth. At the same time, they will also be putting surplus electricity, so electricity that's generated by solar at times when it's generating more than they need at that given time, it'll go back onto the CPS energy grid. But they don't have battery storage on site, and so they will be reliant on CPS. And so, they really strove to be as green as possible, but they can't get to that net zero element yet. And I think that that's an indication that there's still a whole lot of technology that needs to be developed. Whether it's battery resources, even more efficient solar panels. There's all kinds of things that will still drive this. And so it just kind of shows the gap between where we are today and what those kind of lofty goals that San Antonio potentially will adopt are. And I will note also that cities across the country are doing these climate plans. San Antonio is definitely not leading in that element. And these discussions are happening all over the place. But the general consensus among scientists is that, that we as a world have to be at net zero by 2050. And so you're seeing municipalities, states, countries all working toward that goal right now. And the underlying element is that technology needs to continue to develop quickly so that those goals can still be reached in the next 3 decades.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News senior reporter Josh Baugh for joining me for today's episode of the In-Depth Podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.